Awesome. Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for your contributions. And thank you, everyone that has been able to ask a question. I hope you got satisfactory answers from everyone who has been able to answer those questions. Like Venerable Jayola said, we are, need to get to our next segment. And we're actually going to hear from a Reverend John Stonestreet. So before I call him up, let me just tell you guys a little bit about him. Uh, John Stonestreet serves as the president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. He's a sought after author and speaker on areas of faith and culture, theology, worldview, education, and apologetics. John is the daily voice of Breakpoint, the nationally syndicated commentary on the culture founded by the late Chuck Colson. He's also a voice of the Point, a daily 1 minute feature on worldview, apologetics, and cultural issues. Before coming to the Colson Center in 2010, John served in various leadership capacities with Summit Ministries and was on the Biblical Studies faculty at Bryan College, Tennessee. John has co-authored 5 books: A Practical Guide to Culture, A Student's Guide to Culture, Restoring All Things, Same-Sex Marriage, and Making Sense of Your World, a Biblical Worldview. John holds degrees from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and Bryan College. He and his wife have 4 children and live in uh, Colorado Springs. Connect with John at breakpoint.org or follow him on Twitter at JBStonestreet. And with that being said, welcome, John Stonestreet. You can have the floor.
Great. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you. Great to kind of jump in on the tail end of that conversation. It sounds like some really important ground has been covered already, which is really terrific. I was asked to talk about a number of things having to do with marriage, particularly like how do you do this and how do you do that in marriage? And whenever people ask me to talk about that sort of thing, I get really nervous because, first of all, I'm kind of a knucklehead. I'm a typical dad, a typical husband. I'm kind of making this up as I go. And any success that I have as a father or as a husband is because of the person that I married, Sarah. And I used to live in the South, and I don't know if this reference will hit home, but it's an American football reference. But one of my buddies, when he first met Sarah years ago, when we were going to get married, said to me, "Dude, you outkicked your punt coverage." Which basically means I married so far over my head that it was a big score on my part. So I struggled to want to give advice. Not to mention, I feel like I'm too young. Don't I look young? I feel like I'm really young to be giving any sort of marital advice. And there's probably some other folks, here. And this is not an old joke for you, Bishop Scott, but this is, maybe some people here that are, maybe in a better season of life than me to give some of that advice. But I do think it's very important for us to understand something, even as we have spent some really good time today asking questions about how to do various aspects of marriage and family, how to handle expectations, how to handle finances, how to handle challenges, and that's this. If you are a Christian in this culture, in Western culture here in the United States or in Canada, or in most of the Western world, and increasingly in places around the world where Western ideas have been exported, then living as a Christian when it comes to marriage is going to be much more than just a disagreement on how to do specific things. For example, you're going to disagree with the larger culture, the larger world about whether or not it's okay to have sex outside of marriage. But that's not the real disagreement that you have. You're going to have disagreements about whether or not it's okay to end a marriage because one spouse or the other is unhappy. But that's not going to be the real disagreements. In other words, things have dramatically changed about how we think we should do specific things in marriage, or how long we should do marriage, or whether we should do marriage, or something like that. But those disagreements aren't the cause. Those disagreements are the effect. those disagreements are not the root. Those disagreements are the fruit. Does that make sense? As a Christian in today's world and today's culture, we not only have a differing view on how to do marriage or how to do specific aspects of marriage, we fundamentally disagree on what marriage itself is. This is a classic example, which is far more common in today's culture than it has been for a long time. We are at a point where we will find ourselves oftentimes using the same words as as others in our world, but meaning completely different things. One of my friends puts it this way. He says, we often find ourselves in this culture using the same vocabulary, but not the same dictionary. I had this experience years ago when I was on an airplane, and I sat down next to this lady, and she just quickly asked me, what do you do? And I said, well, I work for a Christian organization here in town. And she looked at me and cocked her head back and said, I'm an atheist, prove me wrong. That's how this conversation started. And this was a 3-hour flight. Like, this went on for the entire flight. We fought about whether or not God exists. And right off the bat, she looked at me and she said, prove to me that God exists. Now, look, I've been to seminary. I paid a lot of money to be able to answer that question. But I had learned that sometimes we use the same words, but we don't mean the same things. And so instead of answering her, I said, well, what do you mean by God? And you know what she said back to me was, a grumpy old man with a beard in the sky who can't wait for you to do something wrong so he can strike you dead with a lightning bolt. I promise, that's what she said. And I said to her, lady, I don't believe in Zeus. Like, I don't want to, defend his existence. And the same thing is true when it comes to marriage. You heard in the introduction that I wrote a book several years ago on the topic of same-sex marriage. And people often ask me, why did you write a book about something so controversial? And I always say, well, I was hoping to make some friends, and it didn't work. But no, same-sex, I wrote a book on same-sex marriage. And the reason is because the entire culture was advancing the idea of same-sex marriage with a slogan. I don't know. Do you remember that slogan? Love is love. Love is love. And how will it affect your love if as the argument went, how will it affect your love if we expand the definition of marriage to include people of the same sex? The argument that I made in that book, which isn't original to me, but which I tried to articulate, was that to expand the definition of marriage to include two people of the same gender or the same sex is actually to fundamentally redefine marriage itself. If marriage is more than just two people having affection for each other. And you see, through the whole history of the world, marriage has never been understood as simply an institution that celebrates two people's affection. This is why if you go and ask for a marriage license, especially at least in America, in my experience, they don't ask how deeply in love you are. They don't ask, do you really love each other? Are you going to make it? They don't ask you to take, a romance quiz from Facebook, before they give you a marriage license. What they ask you are questions like, well, are you related to each other in any way? Now, why would they ask that? Because people that are related can be really affectionate to each other. They ask that because if you're related to each other, it's going to have a negative effect on any potential what? Children. Right? So suddenly we realize that according to the state, marriage is not just about affection. It has something to do with babies. Right? They ask you, for example, are you married to anyone else? Now, why do they ask if you're married to anyone else? Well, because if you're married to someone else, you can't be married to each other. Why? Well, because marriage has to do with contracts. Marriage has to do with commitments. You see what I mean? It's not just about love, and it's not just about affection. Now, what's happened in our culture is that across the board, and this is what made same-sex marriage possible in the United States and in Canada and in many of the Western countries. This is what made, if you want to know how it happened here, here's how it happened. It didn't happen because there was a really strong, good debate about, whether or not people of the same sex should be able to get married. What happened was marriage itself lost its definition And marriage became nothing more than just having strong affection for each other. You see, that's where the church fundamentally disagrees with the world. The church doesn't say that marriage is about less than affection. It just says it's about way more than affection. That affection itself is not enough. It's not enough to define what it means to be married. It's not enough to tell you that it needs to be. But see, this is how the language we hear. Well, I love her. Well, I fell in love, as if something happened to you, and now all of a sudden that justifies your willingness or your decision to get married. I want to look at really closely a biblical view of marriage, because I think it is so fundamentally different than a cultural view of marriage. And to answer this question, I want to give you a quote. When I was thinking about what to talk about, and I'd been asked to talk about so many things about how to do marriage, and then I thought, well, I'm too young to answer those questions. I was reminded of a great quote from a guy named T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot said this. He said, whenever you see something new, like a new machine that you've never seen before, two questions come to mind. One question is, well, what can I do with this? Or what can this thing do? The other question, he said, is, what is this thing for? And he asked his readers to say which of those two questions are more important. What can this thing do? Or what is this thing for? Think about it this way. Let's say you walked up and you saw a laptop computer just sitting there, and it wasn't on, it was just sitting there, and you thought to yourself, ooh, this looks weird. What can I do with this? And you could come up with all kinds of things that you could do with this laptop. You know, if it's a MacBook Air and smooth, you could skip it across the lake like a rock. You shouldn't do that, of course, because if you do that with a MacBook Air, it'll break it. If you have a Dell, I'd say go ahead. But if you have a MacBook Air, don't do that. You could think to yourself, oh, this thing opens and closes. It's like a puppet. I'll just have a puppet show with this laptop. Now, you can have a puppet show with a laptop, but it would be kind of a really expensive puppet. You know what I mean? In other words, it wouldn't make sense. Before I know what to do with the laptop, I need to know what a laptop is for. The same thing is true with almost everything in life. Before I know how I'm supposed to behave as a human being, I need to know what I'm for. Before I know how to do church, I need to know what a church is for. In other words, anything that's created, anything that's designed has a purpose. And the purpose of something determines how that something is to be used or how that something is to behave. Marriage is the same way. Now, the dominant disagreement between the church, between Christians and the world, is whether or not marriage was designed. That's the fundamental disagreement. The larger culture thinks marriage is a social construct. In other words, marriage is just something that we invented in order to, handle inheritance rights or property rights or to take care of kids or something like that. Now, here's what's cool is marriage is the best way to handle property rights and inheritance rights and kids, but it wasn't a social construct. Here's one of the most interesting facts about marriage that I learned when I was writing the same-sex marriage book. If you go back in history, the history of the world, the history of nations and civilizations, Western and non-Western, African and beyond, and you look and you ask yourself, which civilization invented written language? You can find that civilization. Or if you said which civilization invented a representative form of government, you can find that. Which civilization decided that the law isn't that the king isn't the law, but the law is the king? Who decided that? You can find all that. But if you go back in history, this is really interesting, and you ask yourself, which civilization invented marriage? Which civilization gave us marriage? You know what? You can't find it. You can't find it. It's almost like it's always been there. It's always been a part of the human experience. It's almost like it was created because it was created by God, and it has a purpose. Now, if marriage then has a purpose, that's got to be the framework that we have. And I wanted to spend time on this today without getting into the specifics necessarily, although I'd be more than happy to answer any of these questions. I think we got about 15 minutes or so for questions. And I'll be happy to talk about any specifics. And I'll give you all the wisdom that I have accumulated in all my years as a husband and a father, which shouldn't take 15 minutes at all, for the record. But look, but I want to go back and look at what marriage is for. And of course, the place where you find out what something was created for is Genesis. Because Genesis doesn't just tell us that the world was created. It gives us an awful lot of really interesting detail about what God had in mind and what was he was trying to accomplish. So if you have Bibles, you can pull out Genesis chapter 1. If you don't have Bibles and you have smartphones, you can turn in your smartphone to Genesis chapter 1. And if you are really spiritual, you should have it memorized anyway. Okay, so let's go to Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So there was a time when there was nothing but God. God is the ultimate source of everything that exists other than himself. Genesis 1:2 is a really interesting verse. And the earth was two things. You remember what it says? The earth was without form and void. Now, another word for void is empty, right? So the earth was formless and it was empty. What do you do if you have something that is formless and empty? You form it. And what do you do with something that's empty? You fill it. And that's exactly what we read about in the rest of Genesis chapter 1. That Genesis, starting in Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, God is taking a formless and an empty place and he's filling it and he's forming it. You can see it the very next phrase. After he says the earth was formless and void, Genesis 1:3 says, and God said, let there be light. And the empty darkness was filled with light. And then what did God do to the light? He separated the light from the darkness and the day from the night. Do you see the separation? You know what another word for separating something is? Forming it, shaping it, right? So he's taking something that's empty, darkness, filling it with light. He's taking something that's formless and he's creating structure and boundary and guidelines. And you know what? You can take some time and read through the rest of the 5 days of creation, the other 5 days of creation, and you'll see the same thing. God fills the empty waters. Well, first of all, he separates the waters from the dry ground, right? And then he fills the waters with fish, and then he separates them all into their own kind. He creates living creatures to cover all the face of the earth, and he separates them all into their own kind. So God is forming and filling and forming and filling. And every time he does it, he looks at what he had made and he makes a pronouncement. He says, behold, it is good. So God's design is not only the source of everything that we have, it's actually a good design. And it's good because it accomplishes what he wants for it, that the earth would be full of life, teeming with existence and diversity and beauty and goodness and so on. And then he gets, and by the way, it's really interesting too, as you know, the way that God creates everything in the world is that he speaks it, let there be, and it was so. Now, if you're an Israelite looking at this passage, this first chapter for the first time, this chapter is written in a way to help you remember it, right? Because there's these repeated words like, and God said, let there be, and it was so. And God saw all that he had made, and it was good. And God, and the evening and the morning was the first day. And that repeats itself, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, all the way to day 6. But when you get to day 6, the language changes. Now, we've seen this so many times, we're probably missed this or we're not really interested. But if you're a culture like the early Israelites were, where you were not reading this, you were actually hearing it and repeating it and memorizing it, then the change in language is kind of like a device to get your attention. It kind of is like, oh, pay attention here. Because God doesn't say, let there be marriage. He says, let us make man in our image after our likeness. And let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. So suddenly you have a change in language. It's not a let there be, it's a let us make. The whole Trinity, the us, the whole Trinity is involved in this. And God just created this amazing world and he commands it to be fruitful and to be teeming with life, but he needs someone to kind of look after it. He needs someone to rule over it in his place, not as if they're in charge, but to rule as him in the world that he had made. And that's where the image bearers come in. Let us make man in our image after our likeness. and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. And God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Right? And what's interesting in here is just a couple things. And you can find this, by the way, Genesis 1, 26 through 28 is where I'm at right now, that the language changes. That the language changes because God's going to put a ruler. God created a whole lot of things, but only one thing to rule over the created order, and that's his image bearers. And they're not supposed to do it as if they're in charge. They're supposed to do it so that it fulfills God's purpose. And this is really cool in verse 27, in case you missed this. Before we know Eve's name, we know that she's made in God's image. That's for Genesis 1:27. So the image bearingness is owned by both male and female, right? And then God saw all that he had made, and he said, it is not good. It is very good. So this is a created act by God that takes the entire project to a new level. This is going to allow the created order to fulfill his purpose. Now that's Genesis 1. Genesis 2 takes us into a really deep dive on that creation of man and woman. In fact, what's so interesting about Genesis 2 is that this is before the fall of man, before Adam and Eve sin. That's, of course, in Genesis 3. And even before Adam and Eve sin, Genesis 2, God says something's not good. That God created man, but something's not good. Now, it's not that something's morally not good because there's no sin in the world. Something's not good in the sense that something's incomplete. In fact, here's what it says. I think I'm doing this off memory. I think it's right around verse 7 or 8. And God said, God said, it is not good that man should be alone. Now, very often what you'll hear is that alone word interpreted as lonely, as if Adam was lonely. But that's not what this means. And here's how you know. First of all, Adam is hanging out with God. He's emotionally fine. He's not emotionally lonely. And here's how you also know that is because in Genesis 2, it says, and God said, it's not good that man is alone. I will make him a suitable helper. He didn't say, it's not good that man is alone. I will make him someone to keep him company or someone to meet his deepest emotional needs. It said, I will make him a helper suitable for him. What did Adam need help doing? Fulfilling his God-given purpose. What was that? Go back to Genesis 1, 26, 27, 28. And God blessed them and said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Remember Genesis 1, 2, the earth was empty and it was formless. So you remember what God did? He filled it and he formed it. And then he just told Adam, keep filling it, keep forming it. So Adam and Eve are actually supposed to do this job, or Adam's supposed to do this job. And you know what? He can't do it by himself. Adam needs help filling the earth. Now, that should be somewhat obvious, and I hope everyone knows what we talk about. Adam needed help procreating. This is such a fascinating thing about sexuality. This is why sexuality is about so much more than pleasure seeking, right? It's because every biological function that God gave you as part of being human, you don't need any help with, unless you have a disability or an injury. You don't need help respirating. You don't need help circulating. You don't need help digesting. It's a bad day when you need help digesting, right? But there's one biological thing that God created you to do that you need help with. And not just any help. You need a suitable help, and that is procreating. You need help procreating. And that's what God says to Adam. It's not good that man is alone. Now, what I love about Genesis 2, one of the things I love about Genesis 2 is that sometimes we look at it and think there are two stories there. The first one is that, well, God says that Adam is alone and that's not good. So he, puts him to sleep and takes his rib and makes Eve out of it. And that's in there. And we think that that's one story and the other story is the naming of the animals. Here's what's cool. Those aren't two stories. It's the same story. Go check it out. Genesis chapter 2. Here's the flow of it. God says, not good that man should be alone. I'm going to make him a suitable helper. Adam, I want you to name the animals. Adam names the animals. And at the end, guess what the conclusion is? Of all the animals, there was not a helper that was found. So literally, by giving Adam the job to name the animals, he's telling Adam, hey, go look for some help. But not a suitable helper was found. When I was writing the book on marriage, I had some weird thoughts. One of them was this one. I thought, that's unfair because animals are really helpful, right? I mean, animals give us clothes, animals pull our plows, animals give us tasty bacon. I mean, animals are great for us, right? But Adam didn't just need help. Adam needed suitable help, is how the word is in the Hebrew, which is fascinating because here's what we need to know. Ready? Another Adam wouldn't have been a suitable helper either. An Eve could not be helped by another Eve. So really, the point of marriage, the purpose of marriage is not about our own happiness. That doesn't mean marriage doesn't make you happy or that there's not happiness in marriage. Don't get me wrong. I'm just pointing out something that C.S. Lewis said, that if something is created, do not confuse an outcome with a purpose. Let me say that again. When something is designed and created, don't confuse an outcome with a purpose. The outcome is happiness. That's one of the great things about it. I married Sarah, after when I was 27. I lived on my own for several years out of college, shared a house with a good friend named Ted. Ted and I were good buds, man. We hung out. We did all kinds of stuff together. I got to tell you, I like coming home to Sarah more than coming home to Ted. All right. So there's a side benefit of companionship to marriage. But companionship is not what marriage is. Marriage is the way that God has enabled many men and many women to fulfill their purpose, the original purpose that God gave Adam and Eve in the garden. Now, that doesn't mean that someone who's not married can't fulfill their God-given purpose, right? Because we've got a diversity of ways that we're fruitful and we multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. But you know what? One of those ways is babies. And the world needs babies. So this is a huge realization that God created marriage for something bigger than our own happiness. And here's why that's vital, because every single message you hear in every popular song and every popular movie from TV shows and so on is this, that marriage is about your personal happiness. So when you're happy, get married. If you're no longer happy, don't get married. If someone of the same sex makes you happy, then marry them. If 2 or 3 or 4 people make you happy, and that's the next stage, by the way, is going beyond couples to thruples and quadruples, then hey, marry them too. That's what it is. When you reduce marriage down to happiness, then you have fundamentally missed this big, beautiful thing that God created. And let me also say this just quickly, and then we can take some questions, if that's okay. Shoot, I lost my train of thought. This was going to be life-changing, I promise, and it just slipped out. Sorry, I apologize to lose this thing that was going to make all the difference in your eternity. Shoot, hold on, I'm getting there. Oh, man. Oh, what was it? I'm sure it'll come back during the Q&A. Let's just I'm sorry. I just went out the door. So, no, this is it. This is it. Here's the other thing that Genesis 2 tells you. Ready? Genesis 2 not only tells you that there's a purpose to marriage, and that marriage, by the way, is the fundamental way that God was going to help humans accomplish his purpose for the whole creation. This is how the filling and forming was going to happen, I mean, that's a cool enough thing about marriage, right? I mean, can you imagine this conversation between God and Adam? Hey, Adam, I got a job for you. Sure, God, what is it? Adam, I want you to take care of this whole earth. I want you to, make it grow. I want you to pull the weeds, man. I want you to make this thing everything that I always intended for it. Sure, God, how big is the earth? 24,000 miles around, Adam. Now go mow it, right? I mean, that is a big job description, right? So he needed that help, and that's the beauty of it. But here's the other side of it. This proves that God is kind. When Adam is put to sleep and God takes his rib, makes woman, and Adam wakes up and he sees Eve. Many Hebrew scholars think that what he does is break out in song. In other words, This is like the first really goofy, cheesy, romantic moment from a movie scene that Adam sees Eve and just bust out, right? Now, here's why this is important. God wanted humans to fill the earth. He could have come up with all kinds of ways for humans to fill the earth, one that didn't require another person. There was this old movie years ago called Gremlins. If you haven't seen it, please don't watch it. It's terrible. But it had to do with these creatures that would reproduce when they got wet. Like they get a drop of water on this little lizard thing and it would pop out and make. God could have had us reproduce like that. Is that the dumbest thing you've thought of today right there? God could have had us reproduce by getting wet. But instead, God gave us one another. And he gave us the possibility to populate the earth in this beautiful, vulnerable, uniting, weird, awkward sort of activity called sexuality. And when we take sex and just throw it around to whoever wants it or whenever we want it outside of its God-given context, we take something that is a good, beautiful, kind gift from a beautiful, kind creator, and we just cheapen it like it's just junk food. And when you have that bigger picture in mind about what marriage is for and what humanity is for, it helps us understand what sexuality is for. And once you get that in your mind, it's a lot harder to just do whatever you want with it because it's such a big, beautiful, perfect gift. All right. I don't know who's hosting this Q&A time, but I would be happy to just take another maybe 10 or 15 minutes if that is good. You know, if that's the plan. That's what I had in my notes here. So be happy if anybody has any thoughts.
That's a very...
I think you're muted. I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you there, sir. There we go.
Hello. Yes, I thank you very much. That's very good presentation. The first question to you, sir, is this. When it comes to the phrase, love is love, what about love and age? Because some people believe that age shouldn't matter. What matter should be the love. So
Yeah.
any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. I have lots of thoughts on that. And this is what happens when love is reduced down to just strong emotions or strong feelings. You know, I talked about you having the same word, but different definitions. Almost anywhere in our culture that the word love is used, it's either used. In fact, this is true in too many churches as well. And our bishop just a few minutes before this asked the question about this recent letter with our friends in ACNA and so on. And one of the things that he pointed out in his very good work on this issue, and I thank you, Bishop Felix, for your great work on this issue. But one of the things you pointed out was that we oftentimes think of loving our neighbor as being this kind of squishy, sentimental feeling sort of thing. And the willingness to look at someone and love them enough to say, this is wrong, this is sin, this is not true, this is not good, is lost, unfortunately, in far too many churches. And to this question, it's lost in for too many Christians, that we think if I have strong emotions for someone else, I therefore love them. That's a definition of love that doesn't come from Scripture. That's a definition of love that comes from too many other places in our culture. Now, it doesn't mean that feelings aren't a part of our love. What it means is that feelings aren't enough to define love. What did John say? This is how we know what love is. Not that we love God, but that he first loved us. No one has more life than they lay down their life. No one who's shown more love than this, that he's laid down his life for his friends. In other words, the Bible immediately puts love in a category of action, of doing something that is for the good of another. So I don't think age is necessarily a boundary for that, but I also don't think feelings are enough to completely erase the reality that age sometimes presents, if that makes any sense. And the most important way I can answer this question is know what love is. And you're not going to know what love is from, the movies in our culture, the songs in our culture. And honestly, frankly, for that point, and I might get in trouble for this, in many of the praise songs that we sing, if we don't know what love is and we talk about loving Jesus, I wonder if so many of our, especially young people, if the only way they know how to think about love is feelings, and then we talk about loving Jesus, then that's a pretty weak, sad, view of feelings. It doesn't actually pull us into any commitment or an understanding that he first loved us. Sometimes we sing praise songs that sound like Jesus is our boyfriend or girlfriend instead of the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, sovereign over all creation, God made flesh, who came and died for us and now sits on the throne, right hand of the throne of God. And so much revolves in that question in my mind around defining love. I'll give you one source. If you want the best book you need to read on love and what it means, it's from C.S. Lewis, and the book is called The Four Loves. The Four Loves. Lewis goes through 4 different words in the Greek New Testament that we now translate as love, but they're very different concepts. Friendship, sentimentality, not sentimentality, but, a strong kind of affection, eros, erotic love, which is a God-given good love as well. And then, of course, agape, the kind that love that none of us have ever pulled off, but God always pulls off.
Thank you very much for that. We go on. There's another question. I'm going to bring together multiple questions here that seems to talk about the same thing. How do you coexist with science and religion? Does God exist, or did we create him? Do you think God stays in heaven because he too lives in fear of what he had created? And finally on that, how do you justify how science conflicts with the belief of how Earth was created to Christians?
Great questions. Can you leave these up here just so I can refer back to them instead of hiding them? And especially, I'm going to go and if it's okay, I want to hit the second one first. So if you can scroll to where those other 2 questions were. There we go, right there. Do you think God stays in heaven because he too lives in fear of what he's created? Well, that's exactly what the Christian worldview says didn't happen. The Christian worldview, the Bible from the beginning to the end, describes a God who consistently comes and actually makes himself known and present in the world that he created. Now, I think there's a fundamental issue here of whether heaven is like a place like, next door and the door is shut. And I don't think that's how the Bible talks about heaven. Heaven is a different, the place where God dwells is a different realm because God is of a different sort of person, a different sort of character and creature. Sorry, not creature, wrong word, a different being than the rest of us. So heaven isn't like a place where it's like you got to cross the river and through the woods and open the door to get to heaven. Heaven is the realm in which God resides. And also, eventually, the Bible tells us that heaven is going to overwhelm earth so that earth then becomes part of the new heavens and new earth. And there's not going to be this division that we kind of perceive here. But the more important way to answer this question, and I think this is absolutely critical to understand, is the very first chapter as it describes Adam and Eve, describes God coming to the world that he had made and walking with them. And then when Adam and Eve sin, God comes and deals with them personally. And then he comes and does the same thing with Cain. And then he does the same thing with Enoch. And then he does the same thing with Abraham. And he does Noah first, then Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, appears to all of them, appears to the whole nation of Israel. He actually comes and indwells the temple. And then he becomes fully God. As fully God, he becomes fully man in the person of Jesus Christ. So God doesn't stay in heaven. That's never been true. That reflects a wrong understanding of heaven and a wrong understanding of it's just never what Christianity has ever said. In fact, Jesus said when he ascended into heaven, he said, it's good that I go away because I'm going to send you the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit is also an expression, a full expression of the Godhead that now comes and dwells in the world that he has made. This is very different than Islam. Now, Islam posits a God who doesn't get his hands dirty in the world that he had made. Christianity has a God who gets his hands dirty in the world that he had made, not morally dirty, not sinful dirty, but actually comes and is a victim. So no, there's not a fear. So that's just, I don't know where that question comes from. It's just, it reflects just a completely wrong understanding of what Christianity is and has always taught. The second question that has to do with science and religion, and I can put these two together. How does science and religion coexist? A couple things. First of all, and there's a number of people who have written on this from both Christian and non-Christian points of view. I'll take you, for example, to a guy named Luc Ferry, who's an atheist at the University of Paris, or you can look at some of the great sweeping histories of the world. And here's what you need to know. Christianity gave birth to science. Science came out of a Christian understanding of the world. And I'll tell you why. If you start kind of in paganism, cultures that believed that there wasn't one sovereign God over the universe, but there were many gods over many smaller parts of the universe, they never imagined that science was possible. In other words, that worldview, that vision of reality makes science impossible, because science, requires that things can be known and that things are consistent and repeatable. But if you have Zeus over here and other gods over here and other gods over here and other gods over here, whether you're talking about the Babylonian pantheon of gods or the Greeks or the Romans, then this God has this God has this. There's no possible way to have consistency in the universe. It was when Christianity came along, and with Christianity came this view that I alluded to a little bit earlier, that we are made in his image, God's image. That means that God has made the world understandable. There's a consistency in the way that the world was made. And he has made us with the ability to understand and know it. And that's why, if you go through the history of science, what you'll find is that an incredible number of them were believers in God, specifically the Christian understanding of God. So the idea that science and the Bible are inconsistent or incompatible is actually a myth. Now, that doesn't mean the church has a perfect history of dealing with scientific exploration and scientific discovery. They didn't. But here's another thing to understand. Let's say that atheism is true. Let's do a hypothetical. Let's say that atheism is true. If atheism is true, then you and I are the products of a mindless, purposeless process of evolution, is the best explanation we have right now. In other words, there's not a purpose to why we exist. And as many atheistic scientists have pointed out, if we had to do it all over again, there's virtually no chance humans would come to exist. And everything that exists is basically mindless and purposeless and pretty much an accident. If everything is an accident, then our brains are an accident. If our brains are an accident, then we have no reason to trust our brains and what they discover. In other words, atheism is a fatal flaw. Let me say it a different way. Atheism is a fatal blow to science. Because if atheism is true, then we can't trust our science, which tells us that it's true. If atheism is true, then our minds aren't reliable. They're pieces of meat like everything else. So this is a real problem. Christianity doesn't have that problem. Christianity says that there's actually a mind and an ability to understand that was given to us by God, and that we're actually able to understand, and it celebrates human discovery. And as I described earlier in my talk, God actually created humans to do that kind of work, scientific work, technological work in the creation, to build and to fill and to form. And so there's not a conflict. So that doesn't mean Christians have always done the right thing when it comes to science. That doesn't mean that all scientists are Christians, but many of them are, including many right now. Some of the most important scientists on the planet right now, particularly in the field of medicine, are Christians. So it's just an overblown myth to say that the two are incompatible.
Thank you very much. Well, what we are going to do now is I'm going to ask you one more question. Then there are some questions directed to our Lord Bishop. I will push that up. Then there is somebody who has signified to ask a question that could help our future arrangement. So, how do Blacks reconcile the sad truth that the Bible not only condoned slavery, but was used as support to keep them in bondage for several hundred years?
And did you want me to address this question or the bishop?
Yes, please. Use that.
Okay. This is a difficult part of the history, and it's a difficult part of the history because the church failed on this one just miserably, particularly the British church for a while, the American church for a longer time, not to mention Roman Catholics and some of those places. Let me say this: the Bible was used to justify slavery by some. So was government, so was nature, so was evolution. A lot of things were used to justify slavery. And of course, in countries in which Christianity did not have a strong presence, and I'm thinking particularly in some tribal areas of Africa, where Africans enslaved other Africans, and that actually became the birth of the trade that became transatlantic to Westerners. It wasn't Christianity at all that was used. It wasn't Christianity or the Bible at all that was used to justify slavery. It was things within their own their own tribes with their own religious understanding. So to put all of this weight on Christianity is wrong. It's also wrong to say that Christians don't bear any responsibility at all. They absolutely do. The other thing, a couple other things, though, to think about as we advance this is that the first people to actually start a campaign, because the idea came to them, it occurred to them that slavery wasn't a normal part of life and shouldn't be legal and justified, were Christians. Now, that's something that everyone agrees on from history because it's actually true. If you start at the very beginning and you go through the whole history of the world, slavery was present in every civilization. It was considered a normal part of life. As things were commodified, one of the things that were commodified was work. Now, not all slavery looked the same. African slavery at the hands of the Dutch and the British was particularly harsh and brutal. But slavery was considered a normal part of life until a group of Christians came along. And it was a group of Christians that thought to themselves, if everyone's made in the image and likeness of God, then everyone belongs to God, not to anybody else. That was an idea that was only available to their thinking and only available to challenge the culture from the Bible. You certainly don't get that same idea from Islam, which also was responsible and used to justify slavery in much of the world. You don't get that idea from, you certainly don't get that idea from paganism, right? Where, the gods enslaved each other. And so therefore the subjects of the gods could be enslaved. And quite honestly, you can't get this idea from atheism today. Now, atheism, most atheists would say completely, oh, no, slavery is absolutely wrong. No one owns anybody else. And they should say that, but they have no reason to say that in their own belief system. Because if atheism is true and evolution is the story of the world and how we all got here, then the world actually advances along the lines of what's called survival of the fittest survive. And so if I can actually advance my DNA, my offspring, by enslaving and making you work for me, then in an evolutionary framework, that's completely okay. So the church has a dark history. The American church in particular in the South has a bad history when it comes to issues of race. There's no question at all. It's just essential that we understand that everyone has a bad history on slavery. And it was Christians who came up with the idea that slavery wasn't normal. And it's only a biblical understanding of who we are as made in the image of God that can give us a solid enough foundation to eliminate slavery from history. And that's why, if you look at the great leaders, on racial reconciliation, whether it has to do with, the horrific slave trade that America participated in with the African slave trade, or whether we're talking about in other parts of the world, including intertribal violence. And I'm thinking of Rwanda and other places, that pretty much Christianity has a solution to this and nobody else does. Because Christianity can look at it and say, this is not the way it should be. Atheism and Islam look at slavery and they have no grounding to say, this is not the way it should be. The should part of this is absolutely essential. So I don't know, that's a very, very hard question to answer in a short amount of time, but I'm happy. Hopefully we were able to get there. I can point people to some really wonderful books on this. All this stuff has been dealt with pretty thoroughly. And I appreciate the questions, even from those. You respectfully, Christians can't be the first people that came up with the abolition of slavery. It was wrong. I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name here, about Christians can't be the first people to come up with the abolition of slavery. Systemically, yes, they were. The only people other than a Christian civilization that came up with the idea. Now, I'm not saying that slaves themselves thought, I don't want to be slaves, and they tried to escape. That happened. What I'm talking about is the idea that slavery shouldn't be a part of culture. Slavery shouldn't be a part of the world, if that makes sense. And that came from Christians. The only exception to that was in the 3rd century AD after Christ, there was a sect of Judaism that lived kind of out in the desert, escaping persecution. And they also were anti-slavery. And the guy, by the way, who's done the history on this is a guy named Rodney Stark, S-T-A-R-K. He's a scholar at Baylor University, he wrote the book when he was at the University of Washington. And it's called For the Glory of God. The book is called For the Glory of God by Rodney Stark. And so, yeah, I don't mean slaves never thought, I don't want to be a slave. What I mean is that actually saying, this should not be part of our world. Like, we should outlaw this. This should be illegal. This needs to be stopped. That actually didn't exist before Christians brought it to, and it lasted longer than it should have. There's no question. But yeah.
Thank you very much for that. This one will go to our Lord Bishop. I will put 3 questions together very quickly. Advice to teenage believers. Advice to teenage believers. How to approach marriage, preparation, appropriate age, etc. Also, what is the procedure for a man and a woman to get married in the Anglican Church, e.g., premarital counseling requirement, and how long? And finally, on that, as Nigerians, the church encourages marrying, focusing largely on our ethnicity. What do you think about church, marriage, and ethnicity?
Okay. All right. Let me thank you, John Stonestreet. Thank you so much for a great presentation as always. Very grateful. Let me. It's a lot of questions. You people want to kill me today with those questions. So, all right. Let me start with the easier one. What do you need to do? What is the procedure for a man and woman to get married in the Anglican Church? First and foremost, they have to decide that they want to get married. So that's where it begins. There has to be a free consent, free will, and competent consent that they want to get married. And so when that decision is made, then they need to go to their parents. There's the traditional aspect of things, especially if you're Nigerian. So you need to talk to your parents, your mom and dad on both sides that you want to get married. If your parents are deceased, you need to talk to the next of kin, because marriage isn't just about 2 of you. The families are involved. All right. So after you've done those things and the traditional requirements, for instance, in Nigeria, you have to go home, do the dowry, pay the dowry if that is required. and the other traditional expectations. If it is here, for instance, I've got a daughter, so she is Canadian. So we're going to do it the Canadian way. So there'll be no dowry paid, but you have to demonstrate to me that you have enough money to care for my daughter. So, all right. So because if you're the man, I expect you to take care of your wife. So if you cannot demonstrate to Bishop Orji that you can take care of my daughter, you are not getting married to her. So, all right. So the so you do that, and then you come to your clergy. So at this point, you come to the church, the Anglican Church. At this point, you come to your clergy, who will ask you some of these questions that I've asked you. The people in your life know about this, or are you eloping? Is this an elopement? And then ask you questions about your faith, your commitment to Christ and commitment to the church. And then the next step is marriage counseling, premarital counseling. And it depends on the clergy, but at least there should be about 5 sessions where you talk about what is marriage, the purpose of marriage, talk about God's intention and all of that, talk about managing of your finances, parenting, talk about all kinds of things. I have about 10 classes. I wrote a booklet on this. It's 10 classes that I do for those getting married. So you need to really have time to talk about this, ask your questions, deal with issues of expectation in marriage, because don't believe that the other person doesn't have expectations of you. So you need to put that on the table. What are those expectations? And be honest about whether you can fulfill them. All right, so you have that marital preparation. There should be about 5, at least 4 sessions. And then during these premarital classes, you do have to apply to the county or to your city for what is called marriage license. All right, so you do need to apply for marriage license. And that is where you go, as Reverend John Stonestreet mentioned. They're going to ask you, have you been married before? So that they'll do an investigation with regard to bigamy. In other words, do you have a wife somewhere in Canada and you want to get married here in the U.S., or you have a wife somewhere in Nigeria and you're getting married to somebody here. So that's the whole point of that marriage license. The city will look into that to make sure there is no bigamy or polygamy going to take place here. So when you get that marriage license, then you bring it to the priest. And by this time, you're coming to the end of your marriage preparation. And it's depending on the state or the city, you have to get married within 3 months of getting this license. So if you don't get married within 3 months of getting this license, the license elapses. All right, so except, if you're in the military, you can get married within 72 hours. If you're not in the military, you're not allowed to get married within 72 hours of getting your license. So there are various rules. So you get that marriage license, you bring it to your priest, and then the wedding would have been scheduled by now. You look at the wedding ceremony, make sure you want to say the vows, and then there's a wedding ceremony, and we get you married. The priest will sign the document, you and your spouse will sign, your witnesses will sign, and that license is sent back to the county. And then the county will prepare a marriage certificate, and that will be mailed to you. So you're married in church. When the priest says, now that you've joined together, I pronounce you married, you're actually married at that point. All right, so that's what you do with church. Let's go to the next question.
Yeah.
All right, I think there's a question.
As Nigerians.
Okay, I see it. Yeah. All right, as Nigerians, the church encourages marrying focusing largely on our ethnicity. What do you think about church, marriage, and ethnicity? A very good question. Unfortunately, we still have problems of tribalism. We do have problems of tribalism. You know, I know we complain about racism in North America, but Nigerians, and I think most of us here, we are Nigerians, we still have problem with tribalism. And that affects marriage. And part of the reason why people want to get married within their cultures, within their tribes, is to avoid cultural differences and conflicts arising out of cultural differences. So that's one of the reasons. But from the point of view of the church, the Christian church, the Bible does not insist or does not command and does not require you to marry somebody from your ethnicity or from your race. As all of you know, my wife is Canadian, she's not Nigerian, she's not Black. It's because I believe that the Bible allows me to do that. And secondly, I love my wife. So it's, so if a church is putting pressure on you to marry from your ethnicity, you do need to correct your pastor. And if they refuse to be corrected, you need another church. All right, so I don't know whether that helps. You know, so don't feel that you have to. Now, much of the pressure doesn't come from the church. It actually comes from your parents. It's the parents that's the problem. And so you want to say to your parents, they should pray for you, they should encourage you and guide you, but not force you to marry somebody from a particular race, or a particular ethnicity or tribe. All right, I think I have there's a third question. What is the procedure for a man, okay, as Nigerians?
Yes, you've answered those inclusive.
Okay, advice to teenage believers, how to approach marriage. Okay, now that's the most difficult one here. First and foremost, you approach marriage with prayer. All right, please begin with prayer. You know, call upon God, ask God to guide you. That's what I did. All right, so I'm just going to tell you what I did. I did a lot of praying. In fact, I did a lot of fasting. I actually fasted, believe it or not. You know, I had a friend in Vancouver because I was a student at Regent College in Vancouver. So there was a professor, a Yoruba professor who came from the University of Ibadan. So he was doing some post-doc program at University of British Columbia. So we were very good friends while I was a student, and he would fast with me every Wednesday because I said to him, you know, Prof, I want to get married yesterday. I think that's the way I put it to him. You know, I want to get married yesterday. He said, oh, Bro Felix, you're in trouble. And then he said, we're going to fast and pray. So that professor will come every Wednesday to Regent College to pray and fast with me. And this is, I mean, an older man, you know, his kids were already in college. So prayer and fasting, seek the face of God, trust God, depend on God, don't lean on the arm of your flesh. So that's first and foremost. Secondly, pay attention to what the Bible says about Christian character. So we talked about this, you know, moral character, biblical character is very important for yourself and for the person you're looking for. All right, so don't expect your wife to be or your husband to be a person of good character while you yourself, you have rotten character. So you got to look at yourself and then, you know, think about the fruit of the Spirit. That's what I mean by character. The fruit of the Spirit, you know, love, joy, self-control, kindness, goodness, you know, patience, and all of that, you know, and sexual purity. So think about those things when you start looking for a marriage partner. And also, you do, you know, practically, if you want to fish, you don't go to the desert, you don't go to El Paso for fishing. you go to the sea. You know, El Paso is a desert. That's why I'm using El Paso. You know, you're gonna have to find where those young girls are. So if you're a young man here, you know, don't stay in your bedroom hoping that some lady will be parachuted from the sky into your room. You need to go to church. All right, you need to go to places where there are young people like you. You know, find places of intersection where you can meet people. And I know it's very difficult for a lot of you in North America. It wasn't that bad in Nigeria, where we came from. So, and with COVID, it makes it much more difficult. So be patient. All right. So be looking, be patient, and this is where I want to encourage adults. Those of you who are adults here, you can actually make recommendations, right? Don't force anybody on anybody, but do make recommendations. I did a lot of matchmaking. I still do, you know, so when I was a clergyman in Canada at our church in Vancouver, there are so many singles. We had almost about 300 young men and women from the neighboring colleges in our church, and they were all playing this game. And every now and then I pull one or two in my office and I ask them, what are you waiting for? You know, what are you, and they tell me I'm waiting for number one. And I say, well, what are you number one yourself? You know, and so I would say, well, what about this lady? Do you like her? Or what about this guy? Do you like him? And sometimes they say, yes, I like him. And then I call the guy. I said, well, do you like this lady? And they say, yes. I said, okay, I'll see both of you in my office next week. So I did a bunch of weddings that way because I love doing weddings. All right, they're great. It's a happy occasion. Ship them off and enjoy myself. So, so matchmaking is good. You know, recommend people, especially here in North America, where it is very difficult to get spouses. So. I'm very careful about singles groups on the internet, but you know, some people meet that way, so that's fine. So those are the things, and then when you find somebody you like, all right, okay. So I'm going to go Nigerian on some of you now, especially those of you who were born here. You know, back home in Nigeria, when you meet somebody you like, you tell them that you like them. Instead of playing cat and mouse behavior, you know, you like them, but you don't want to show it, you know, but you expect them to read your mind. And, you know, there's a cat and mouse thing. So why don't you just be honest and say, look, I like you and I'd like to marry you. All right. So when I met Lillian, my wife in Canada, in the class, it was an evangelism class by Michael Green. So after we had prayed, and I thought, you know what, I like her. And I'd like to marry her. And then I started talking to her, you know, and she introduced me to her pastor. And I told her pastor, you know, I really like to marry her and I want to tell her. So the pastor said, no, don't tell her she's Canadian. If you tell her, she's going to run away, you know, which is partly true. I mean, it is partly true in Canada. I said, no, I'm not Canadian. That's what I said. I'm not Canadian, I'm Nigerian. So within 4 months, I told her. And I waited 4 months because the pastor wouldn't let me tell her. But I got tired of listening to the pastor. I called her. I said, I need to talk to you. And so we went somewhere and I said, you know, I'd like to marry you. And then I started telling her stories about myself. And I said, well, think about it. And then she came back to me and told me yes. So please, young people, I want to appeal to you. Don't play cat and mouse games, you know, because the person you're hanging out with may be interested. Now, if she is not interested or he is not interested and says no, that's fine, right? I mean, so guys, step out, all right? Guys, step out, be a man, talk to the lady, I love you, I'd like to marry you. Don't say God told me to marry you, okay? Don't say that. All right, so step out there and tell them you love them, you want to marry her, and then be honest, be godly about it, no touching, no sex, because as we said earlier, all that stuff will make it difficult to have honest conversations. And so that's what you do. The moment you see somebody you love, please tell them. Don't be afraid.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Robert, this is very great. We are grateful, and I want to say that we are very blessed in our diocese to have the caliber of people of our bishop and all these resource persons. Yes, we are already running out of time. In fact, we run out of our schedule. I will call on our brother, one of the brothers that is anchoring this.
Oh, that's me.
Yes.
One. Okay.
And do this, and don't forget that Nedu Ugbona Guam has a request.
Yes.